The probate courtroom in downtown Phoenix sits under a blistering Arizona sun, its stone facade baking late summer heat. Inside, the air conditioning hums, but the atmosphere is anything but cool. Judge Allison Burke sits behind the bench, her reading glasses perched on her nose, staring at a single white envelope sealed with red evidence tape.
The room is silent, except for the faint rustle of paper and the nervous breathing of two men seated on opposite sides of the aisle. Ethan Cole sits on the left, hands folded on the table in front of him, his attorney Alex Carter leaning close to whisper something reassuring. Ethan is 32, lean, with dark hair that falls just above his eyes. He looks exhausted, like a man who hasn't slept in weeks, and he hasn't. Not since he decided to step forward and claim what he believes is rightfully his, a share of his father's estate. Across the room, Marcus Whitmore sits rigid, his suit perfectly tailored, his jaw clenched. Marcus is older, 47, with graying temples and the bearing of someone who has never questioned his place in the world, until now. His attorney, Andrea Miller, a sharp prosecutor turned estate litigator, taps a pen against her legal pad, eyes locked on the envelope in the judge's hands. That envelope contains a DNA test, a test that, if authentic, will rewrite the entire story of the Whitmore family fortune. A test that has been hidden, suppressed, and buried for nearly a decade. And now, in this quiet courtroom, it's about to be opened. Judge Burke looks up, her voice is steady, measured. She asks the room a simple question. Is this evidence admissible? Can the chain of custody be trusted? And more importantly, does the truth inside matter if the process that brought it here was flawed? No one answers. Not yet. Because the answer will take hours to uncover, and by the time it's revealed, lives will be altered forever. This is the story of how a single envelope, a piece of paper sealed in plastic, became the center of a probate battle worth $7 million. This is the story of Ethan Cole, a man who grew up never knowing his father, who spent his childhood wondering why he was kept at arm's length, why family gatherings always felt like he was watching from outside a window. This is the story of Marcus Whitmore, a man who believed he was the sole heir, the rightful son, the only one who mattered. And this is the story of a DNA test that exposed the truth they hid for years. Let's go back to where it all began, 3 months earlier. A law office in Scottsdale. The reading of the will of David Whitmore, a real estate developer who built his fortune-flipping commercial properties across the Southwest. David died at 68 from a sudden cardiac event, collapsing in his study while reviewing blueprints for a new shopping center. He left behind a modest will, drafted a decade ago, that named Marcus Whitmore as the primary beneficiary. The estate, $7 million, a collection of rental properties, investment accounts, and a home in Paradise Valley worth $2 million alone. Marcus sat in that office, confident, nodding as the attorney read through the legalese. The executor, a longtime business partner named Richard Hollis, walked through the assets methodically. The rental properties in Tempe and Mesa. The stock portfolio with tech investments that had tripled in value over the past 5 years. The vintage car collection David kept in a climate-controlled garage. All of it destined for Marcus, the son who had stood by David's side through business deals and family holidays, who had learned the real estate trade from his father, who had earned every dollar coming his way. But then came the final paragraph. A handwritten note scrawled in the margin, dated just 2 years prior. It read, "If Ethan comes forward, he deserves to know. See Dr. Nguyen's file." Marcus stopped nodding. He sat forward, his confident posture cracking. He asked what that meant. Richard adjusted his glasses, looked down at the document, then back at Marcus. He said he didn't know. There was no context, no explanation, just a reference to a Dr. Nguyen and a file that no one in the room had ever seen. No one knew who Ethan was. No one knew why David would reference him. And no one understood what truth David thought this Ethan deserved to know. Richard suggested they move forward with the probate process as planned. Marcus was the named heir. The note was cryptic, probably meaningless. Maybe David had been working on too many projects, got confused, wrote down something unrelated. It happened with estate documents sometimes. People added notes that never got resolved. Marcus wanted to believe that. He wanted to close the book on his father's death, grieve properly, and move on. That note changed everything. Ethan Cole wasn't at that reading. He didn't even know David Whitmore had died until a week later, when an old family friend, a woman who used to work at the dental office with Ethan's mother, reached out and told him. She said she saw the obituary in the newspaper. She thought Ethan should know. Ethan thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat in his small apartment in Glendale staring at the wall. Ethan had met David exactly 3 times in his life. The first time he was 8 years old. His mother, Claire, took him to a charity event at a hotel in Scottsdale. David was there with his wife and young Marcus. Claire approached David cautiously, like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. She introduced Ethan. David shook his hand, smiled politely, and moved on. No warmth, no recognition, just a handshake and a nod. The second time, Ethan was 15. He showed up at David's office unannounced. He told the receptionist he needed to speak with Mr. Whitmore about a personal matter. The receptionist asked if he had an appointment. Ethan said no. She asked him to wait. 20 minutes later, she came back and said Mr. Whitmore was unavailable. Ethan left. The third time, Ethan was 23. He tried again. Same office, same receptionist. This time, David came out to the lobby himself. He asked Ethan what he wanted. Ethan said he wanted to talk, to understand why David treated him like a stranger. David looked uncomfortable. He said he didn't know what Ethan was talking about. He said if Ethan needed something, he should contact his attorney. Then David walked back into his office and closed the door. Ethan never tried again. He convinced himself it didn't matter. He had his mother. He had his own life. He didn't need David Whitmore's approval or acknowledgement. But when he heard about the note in the will, if Ethan comes forward, he deserves to know, something inside him shifted. He hired Alex Carter. Alex Carter was known in Phoenix legal circles as the attorney you called when the case seemed unwinnable. He specialized in probate disputes, particularly those involving contested paternity or hidden assets. He had a reputation for digging into family histories, finding documents people thought were lost, and building cases out of whispers and half-truths. When Ethan walked into Carter's office, he brought everything he had. His birth certificate, which listed his mother's name, but left the father's space blank. Old photographs of Claire and David from before Marcus was born. Images Ethan found in a shoebox in his mother's closet. A letter David sent to Claire 33 years ago, a letter that said he needed to move on, that he couldn't be part of her life anymore, that she should raise the child without him. Carter read the letter carefully. He asked Ethan if Claire ever told him explicitly that David was his father. Ethan said she avoided the subject for years, but when he pressed her as a teenager, she finally admitted it. She said David got scared when she got pregnant. He wasn't ready to be a father. He was building his business, dating other women. Claire said she didn't want to trap him, so she let him go. Carter asked if there was any documentation of David's paternity, any formal acknowledgement, any child support payments, any legal proceedings. Ethan shook his head. His mother never pursued anything. She raised him alone, worked 2 jobs, never asked David for a dime. Carter explained that under Arizona law, biological children have the same inheritance rights as legally acknowledged children, but proving biological paternity without a DNA test or formal acknowledgement was nearly impossible. Ethan needed evidence. Hard, scientific, indisputable evidence. That's when Carter started digging into the note. If Ethan comes forward, he deserves to know. See Dr. Nguyen's file. Carter tracked down Dr. Leyland Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen ran a private DNA testing lab in Tempe, a small operation that catered to individuals seeking paternity tests, ancestry reports, and genetic health screenings. Carter found her through a simple internet search. Her website listed her credentials: PhD in molecular biology from UCLA, 15 years of experience in genetic analysis, certified by the American Association of Blood Banks for parentage testing. Carter called her office. The receptionist said Dr. Nguyen would need a court order to release any client records. Carter filed a motion in probate court, explaining that the decedent's will referenced Dr. Nguyen's file and that the information was critical to determining the rightful distribution of the estate. Judge Burke reviewed the motion and issued the order. A week later, Dr. Nguyen sat in a conference room across from Carter and Ethan. She looked uncomfortable, her hands folded on the table, her expression cautious. She said she remembered David Whitmore. It wasn't often someone paid cash for a paternity test and asked for the results to be sealed and stored rather than mailed. She explained that 9 years ago, David walked into her lab without an appointment. He said he needed a paternity test done quickly and quietly. He brought 2 samples. One was his own saliva, swabbed onto a sterile collection card. The other was labeled as Ethan Cole's, though Dr. Nguyen never met Ethan. She asked David how he obtained the second sample. David said it was from a used drinking glass, a fork, something Ethan had touched. He wouldn't say more. Dr. Nguyen told David that testing from secondary sources, objects someone had used, was less reliable than a direct swab, but still possible. David said he understood the limitations. He just needed to know. She ran the test. It took 3 days. When the results came back, she called David and asked him to come to the lab. She handed him a sealed white envelope with red evidence tape across the flap. She told him the result was inside. She offered to explain the findings, but David said no. He just wanted the envelope. He paid in cash, thanked her, and left. Dr. Nguyen said she kept meticulous records. Every test, every sample, every result was logged in her system. She pulled out a binder and showed them the entry: case number, date, client name, sample types, result summary. All of it was there. Carter asked the question that would define the entire case. What was the result? Dr. Nguyen hesitated. She said the result was confidential, sealed at David's request. Carter reminded her of the court order. She nodded, turned to her computer, and pulled up the digital file. She said the test showed a 99.97% probability that David Whitmore was Ethan Cole's biological father. Ethan sat in silence. His hands were shaking. He had spent his entire life wondering, and now he had an answer. David knew. David knew for 9 years and never said a word. Carter asked where the original sealed envelope was now. Dr. Nguyen said David took it. She assumed he destroyed it or kept it somewhere private. She had no idea it still existed until Carter mentioned the note in the will. That's when Carter realized they had a problem. Without the physical envelope, without proof that the test hadn't been tampered with, the result was just a number in a database. And numbers could be changed, fabricated, manipulated. If they were going to use this DNA test in court, they needed the original. They needed the chain of custody to be unbroken. Carter asked Ethan if his mother might know where David kept the envelope. Ethan said he doubted it. Claire hadn't spoken to David in over 30 years, but Carter said they should ask anyway. They did, and Claire had no idea. But she remembered something else. She remembered David's sister, Rebecca Cole. She took her sister Claire's last name after marrying Claire's brother, was in her early 60s, thin, with graying hair pulled back in a bun. She lived alone in a small house in Mesa, worked part-time at a library, and had been estranged from Claire for nearly 20 years. The estrangement stemmed from Rebecca's decision to stay in contact with David Whitmore after he left Claire. Rebecca believed David deserved a chance to know his son, even if he wasn't ready to be a father. Claire saw it as a betrayal. When Carter and Ethan showed up at Rebecca's door, she looked surprised but not shocked. She invited them in, made tea, and sat across from them in her modest living room. She asked what they wanted to know. Carter explained the situation: the will, the note, the DNA test. He asked if Rebecca knew anything about Dr. Nguyen's file. Rebecca set her teacup down carefully. She said she did. She said David contacted her about a year before he died. He called her out of the blue, something he rarely did. He asked if they could meet. She agreed. They met at a coffee shop in Tempe, a neutral location where no one would recognize them. David brought a sealed envelope. He told Rebecca it contained something important. He said if anything happened to him, if he died before Ethan turned 35, she should deliver the envelope to Dr. Nguyen. He made her promise not to open it, not to ask questions, not to tell anyone. He said Ethan deserved the truth, but not yet, not until the time was right. Rebecca asked why he didn't just give the envelope to Ethan directly. David said he wasn't ready. He said he needed more time to figure out how to handle it, how to explain it to Marcus, how to face what he'd done. He said if he died before he could work it out, the envelope would do the explaining for him. Rebecca kept her promise. She took the envelope, stored it in a locked drawer in her bedroom, and waited. When David died, Ethan was 32. Rebecca checked the date on the handwritten note David had given her along with the envelope. The note said, "If I die before Ethan turns 35, give this to Dr. Nguyen. He deserves the truth." Rebecca decided David's death overrode the age requirement. She contacted a private courier service, hired Officer Blake to transport the envelope securely, and instructed him to deliver it to Dr. Nguyen's lab with strict instructions that it was sensitive material. Blake did exactly that. He photographed the sealed envelope before transport, logged the pickup and delivery times, and obtained Dr. Nguyen's signature upon receipt. The envelope, still sealed, was now in Dr. Nguyen's possession, and Dr. Nguyen confirmed it matched the original she had given David 9 years prior. Carter asked Rebecca if she would testify to all of this in court. She said yes. She said she was tired of secrets. She said David made his choices, and now Ethan deserved his truth. Ethan asked why Rebecca never reached out to him before. She said David made her promise not to interfere unless he died. She honored that promise. It was the least she could do for a man who was too afraid to face his own mistakes. When Andrea Miller learned about the DNA test, she didn't panic. She strategized. She had been a prosecutor for 15 years before moving into private practice, and she knew how to dismantle evidence. The key was procedure. Science could be bulletproof, but if the procedure that brought the science to court was flawed, the science became worthless. She filed a motion to exclude the DNA test on the grounds that the chain of custody was broken. Her argument was methodical and precise. She laid out the timeline. 9 years ago, David Whitmore obtained a DNA test. He took the sealed envelope and disappeared with it. No one witnessed him storing it. No one documented its location. For 9 years, the envelope's whereabouts were unknown. Then, a year before David died, he allegedly gave the envelope to Rebecca. But there was no documentation of that transfer, no witnesses, no third-party verification. Rebecca's testimony was the only evidence, and testimony alone wasn't enough to establish chain of custody for scientific evidence. Miller argued that the envelope Rebecca gave to Officer Blake could have been a fake. Rebecca could have fabricated it. Someone else could have fabricated it. David could have tampered with the original and resealed it. Without an unbroken documented chain showing the envelope remained secure and untouched. From the moment Dr. Nguyen handed it to David to the moment it arrived back at her lab, the test was inadmissible. Judge Burke set a hearing to address the motion. She told both sides to prepare their evidence. She made it clear that she took chain of custody seriously. If Carter couldn't prove the envelope's integrity, the case was over. Miller also raised a secondary argument. She said even if the envelope was authentic, the test itself was flawed. Dr. Nguyen admitted she never obtained a sample directly from Ethan. David brought both samples. He could have brought anyone's DNA and labeled it as Ethan's. The test proved David was related to someone, but it didn't prove that someone was Ethan Cole. Carter knew this was his biggest challenge. He needed to prove 2 things: that the envelope was legitimate and that the sample tested actually came from Ethan. The first required documentation, the second required more DNA. Carter filed a motion requesting the court to order a new DNA test, this time with direct samples from Ethan and from David's remains. David had been cremated, but his ashes were stored in an urn at Marcus's home. Carter argued that extracting a sample from the ashes might be possible, or alternatively, Marcus could be tested as a control, since Marcus was undisputedly David's son. Miller objected strenuously. She said subjecting Marcus to a DNA test was an invasion of privacy. Marcus wasn't the one making a claim. He was the legitimate heir. The burden was on Ethan to prove his case, not on Marcus to disprove it. Judge Burke ruled that she would consider the request, but wanted to hear the chain of custody evidence first. If the original test was admissible, a second test might not be necessary. The hearing began on a Tuesday morning in late August. The courtroom was full. Ethan sat beside Carter, dressed in a simple grey suit he had borrowed from a friend. Marcus sat across the aisle with Miller, looking calm but tense, his hands clasped on the table. Behind them, a handful of journalists sat in the gallery, notebooks open. The case had attracted local media attention. A hidden son, a secret DNA test, a $7 million estate. It was the kind of story that wrote itself. Judge Burke entered, took her seat, and called the session to order. She addressed the room, explaining that the day's focus was narrow, whether the DNA test envelope was authentic, and whether the chain of custody was sufficient to admit the test as evidence. Miller stood first. She called her opening witness, Dr. Paul Hendricks, a forensic document examiner with over 30 years of experience. Hendricks had worked for the FBI, testified in hundreds of cases, and specialized in detecting forgeries, alterations, and authentication issues. Miller asked Hendricks to describe his examination of the envelope. Hendricks explained that he had inspected the envelope under high magnification imaging. He looked at the seal, the tape, the ink used for Dr. Nguyen's signature. He compared the materials to commercial evidence tape manufactured in the 2010s. The tape appeared consistent with products available during that time period. The ink on the signature matched the chemical composition of standard ballpoint pens from that era. Miller asked if he could determine when the seal was applied. Hendricks said no. Adhesive tape degrades over time, but environmental factors, humidity, temperature, exposure to light, vary widely. The envelope could have been sealed 9 years ago, or 9 days ago. He couldn't say for certain. Miller asked if tampering was possible. Hendricks nodded. He explained that with enough care and the right tools, someone could remove a seal, access the contents, and reseal the envelope in a way that looked untouched. It required skill and precision, but it was possible. Miller asked if he found any evidence of tampering. Hendricks admitted he didn't. The seal appeared intact, but he said the absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. Just because he didn't find signs of tampering didn't mean tampering hadn't occurred. Carter stood for cross-examination. He approached slowly, his tone measured. He asked Hendricks if he agreed that the seal was consistent with commercial evidence tape from the 2010s. Hendricks said yes. Carter asked if the signature appeared genuine. Hendricks said it was consistent with Dr. Nguyen's known handwriting samples. Carter asked if there was any indication the envelope had been resealed. Hendricks said no, but again, that didn't rule out sophisticated tampering. Carter asked Hendricks to estimate the likelihood that someone could reseal an envelope without leaving any detectable traces. Hendricks hesitated. He said it would require specialized equipment, a clean room environment, and significant expertise. It was possible but difficult. Carter asked if it was more likely the seal was original than tampered. Hendricks said he couldn't make that determination. Both scenarios were possible. Miller called her second witness, a paralegal from Richard Hollis's office, the executor of David's estate. The paralegal, a young woman named Sarah Chen, testified that when they inventoried David's personal belongings after his death, they found no DNA test envelope. They searched his home office, his safe, his filing cabinets, his desk drawers. They went through boxes in the garage, storage units, even his car. Nothing. Miller asked if it was possible they missed something. Sarah said it was possible, but unlikely. They were thorough. They catalogued thousands of items. If the envelope existed, they should have found it. Carter objected. He argued that the absence of the envelope in the places they searched didn't mean it didn't exist. It just meant it wasn't in those places. David could have given it to Rebecca before he died. He could have stored it somewhere else. The paralegal's testimony proved nothing. Judge Burke sustained the objection but noted that the gap in documentation was concerning. She asked Carter to present his evidence. Carter called Officer Blake to the stand. Blake was a private courier in his mid-40s, former military, who ran a small business specializing in transporting sensitive legal documents, medical records, and high-value items. He had been in the business for 12 years and had a spotless reputation. Carter asked Blake to describe his involvement. Blake explained that Rebecca contacted his company in early June, 3 weeks after David's death. She said she needed to transport a sealed envelope to a lab in Tempe. She emphasized it was sensitive, confidential, and needed to be handled with care. Blake agreed to take the job. He met Rebecca at her home in Mesa. She handed him the white envelope, still sealed with red evidence tape. Blake photographed the envelope from multiple angles, documenting the seal and the signature. He logged the pickup time, date, and Rebecca's signature on a transport manifest. Blake drove directly to Dr. Nguyen's lab. The trip took 28 minutes. He delivered the envelope, obtained Dr. Nguyen's signature on the manifest, and photographed the handoff. He kept copies of all documentation, which he submitted to the court as exhibits. Carter asked if Blake opened the envelope at any point. Blake said no. His job was transport, not inspection. Carter asked if anyone else handled the envelope during transport. Blake said no. It remained in his possession the entire time. Miller cross-examined. She asked Blake how he could be sure the envelope Rebecca gave him was the same one David had received 9 years ago. Blake said he couldn't. He only knew he delivered what Rebecca handed him. Miller pressed, "So you have no way of knowing if Rebecca gave you a fake?" Blake said that was correct. He delivered what he was given. Miller asked if Blake verified the contents. Blake said no. The envelope was sealed. Miller asked if he verified Dr. Nguyen's identity when he delivered it. Blake said he asked for identification and confirmed she was the lab director. Miller sat down, satisfied. The courier was credible, but his testimony didn't prove authenticity. It only proved he transported an envelope. Carter called Rebecca to the stand. She walked slowly to the witness box, her hands trembling slightly. She swore to tell the truth and sat down. Carter asked her to explain how she got the envelope. Rebecca took a breath and began. She said David called her in April a year before he died. He asked to meet. They met at a coffee shop in Tempe, a place called The Grind, on a Wednesday afternoon. David looked tired, stressed. He told her he needed a favor. He handed her the sealed envelope and a handwritten note. The note said, "If I die before Ethan turns 35, give this to Dr. Nguyen. He deserves the truth." David made her promise not to open the envelope, not to tell anyone about it, not even Claire. Rebecca asked what was inside. David said it was proof of something he should have acknowledged years ago. Rebecca asked why he didn't just give it to Ethan himself. David said he wasn't ready. He said Marcus didn't know about Ethan. His late wife never knew about Ethan. If the truth came out, it would destroy his relationship with Marcus. He said he needed more time to figure out how to handle it. But if he died before he could, the envelope would speak for him. Rebecca kept the envelope in a locked drawer in her bedroom. She didn't tell Claire. She didn't tell Ethan. She waited. When David died, she knew what she had to do. She called Officer Blake and arranged the transport. Carter asked Rebecca to show the court the handwritten note. She pulled it from her purse. Carter submitted it as evidence. The note was written on a napkin from The Grind, with the coffee shop's logo printed at the top. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. Miller stood for cross-examination. She asked Rebecca why she waited so long to come forward. Rebecca said David made her promise not to involve herself in his life. She kept that promise until his death made it necessary to act. Miller asked if Rebecca had any proof of the meeting at the grind. Rebecca said no, it was a private conversation. Miller asked if anyone else witnessed David giving her the envelope. Rebecca said no. Miller asked if Rebecca ever opened the envelope to verify its contents. Rebecca said no, she had no reason to. Miller asked if Rebecca knew Ethan stood to inherit millions if the DNA test was admitted. Rebecca said she was aware. Miller asked if Rebecca had any financial interest in Ethan's claim. Rebecca said no. She wasn't asking for anything, she just wanted the truth out. Miller asked if Rebecca understood that her testimony was the only link between the envelope Dr. Nguyen created 9 years ago and the envelope Officer Blake delivered 3 months ago. Rebecca said she understood. Miller asked if she was certain the envelope she gave Blake was the same one David gave her. Rebecca said she was certain. She kept it locked. She never took it out except to give it to Blake. Miller sat down. Carter declined to redirect. Rebecca stepped down. Carter called a forensic handwriting expert, Dr. Marcus Liu, who had analyzed the napkin note. Liu testified that he compared the handwriting on the napkin to known samples of David Whitmore's writing, including signatures on legal documents and handwritten notes from his business files. Liu said the writing on the napkin matched David's hand in every measurable way. Letter formation, pressure patterns, slant, spacing, all consistent. He gave his opinion with a high degree of certainty. David Whitmore wrote the note. Miller asked Liu if he could determine when the note was written. Liu said no. Ink analysis could narrow it down to a range of years, but not a specific date. Miller asked if someone could have forged the note using David's handwriting as a model. Liu said it was possible, but unlikely. Forging natural handwriting convincingly required significant skill. Judge Burke asked if the napkin provided any additional authentication. Liu said the napkin's logo matched napkins used by the grind between 2020 and 2024. The coffee shop confirmed they discontinued that design in early 2024. The timeline was consistent with Rebecca's testimony. Court resumed after a brief recess. Carter called Dr. Leyland Nguyen to the stand. This was the critical moment. Nguyen would explain how the test was conducted, why the results were reliable, and why the court should trust the science. Nguyen began with the basics. She explained that DNA testing for paternity uses something called STR analysis. STR stands for short tandem repeat. She asked the judge and jury to imagine DNA as a long string of genetic code, like a sentence made up of letters. Certain sections of that sentence repeat in patterns. For example, the sequence CAG might repeat 5 times in one person and 7 times in another. Those patterns are unique to each individual, like a fingerprint. In a paternity test, the lab compares the repeating patterns in the child's DNA to the patterns in the alleged father's DNA. A child inherits half their DNA from their mother and half from their father. So if you look at the child's patterns and find matches with the alleged father's patterns, you can calculate the probability that the match is due to a biological relationship rather than random chance. Nguyen explained that she tested 13 different STR markers in David and Ethan's case. That's the industry standard for paternity testing. The more markers you test, the more accurate the result. In this case, 12 of the 13 markers matched. The 13th was inconclusive due to sample degradation, but 12 matches was more than enough for a conclusive result. Nguyen walked the court through the math. She used a concept called the paternity index. For each matching marker, the lab calculates how rare that match is in the general population. Then they multiply those probabilities together. In this case, the combined probability was 99.97%. That meant there was a 97% chance David Whitmore was Ethan's biological father, and a 0.03% chance the match was coincidental. Judge Burke asked if 99.97% was considered conclusive. Nguyen said yes. In the field of genetic testing, anything above 99% is treated as a definitive positive. The American Association of Blood Banks, the governing body for parentage testing, considers 99% the threshold for legal paternity. Carter asked Nguyen about the sample David provided for Ethan. Nguyen admitted she never met Ethan. David brought both samples. She couldn't verify the source of the second sample, but she said the DNA in that sample matched the profile consistent with being David's biological offspring. Whoever the sample came from, they were related to David with 99.97% certainty. Miller stood for cross-examination. She focused on the unverified sample. She asked how Nguyen could be sure the sample came from Ethan. Nguyen said she couldn't. David labeled it as Ethan's, and she tested what she was given. Miller asked if David could have brought a sample from anyone. Nguyen said theoretically yes, but she pointed out that if David wanted to fabricate a result, there were easier ways to do it. He could have paid someone to create a fake report. Instead, he paid for a legitimate test and kept the results sealed. That suggested he wanted the truth, not a fabrication. Miller asked if the sample could have degraded over 9 years, affecting the accuracy. Nguyen said DNA is remarkably stable. If stored properly, it can last decades. The envelope was sealed, protecting the contents from moisture and contamination. The sample would have remained viable. Miller asked if it was possible someone tampered with the sample inside the envelope. Nguyen said it was theoretically possible, but unlikely. The seal was intact. If someone opened it, they would have had to reseal it perfectly, and even then, tampering would likely leave traces in the DNA sample itself. Contamination, mixed profiles. She saw none of that. Miller sat down. Carter stood for redirect. He asked Nguyen if she had any doubt about the accuracy of the test she conducted 9 years ago. Nguyen said no. She stood by her work. The test was conducted properly, the results were accurate, and the sample came from someone who was David Whitmore's biological child. Carter introduced financial records from Dr. Nguyen's lab. The records showed a cash payment of $900 on the date David visited the lab. The payment was logged under the client name D. Whitmore, and the service was listed as paternity analysis. Carter asked Nguyen if cash payments were common. Nguyen said they were relatively rare. Most clients paid by credit card or check. Cash suggested someone wanted privacy. Carter submitted the lab's billing log as evidence. The log included the date, the amount, and a handwritten note. Client requested sealed result. No mail, no email, pickup only. Miller objected. She said the payment record didn't prove anything about the sample's authenticity. Carter countered that it corroborated Nguyen's testimony. David paid for a legitimate test. He didn't ask for a fake result. He asked for privacy and control over when the truth would be revealed. Judge Burke admitted the financial records into evidence. Carter played his final card. He introduced surveillance footage from the building where Dr. Nguyen's lab was located. The building's management company kept archived security footage for up to 10 years for insurance purposes. Carter's investigator obtained the footage through a subpoena. The footage showed the building's front entrance. The timestamp read April 14th, 2016. A man matching David Whitmore's description entered the building at 2:47 p.m., carrying a small manila envelope. The footage showed him exiting the building at 4:52 p.m., carrying a white sealed envelope consistent with the evidence envelope. Carter also introduced footage from April 2024, a year before David's death. The footage showed Rebecca entering the building at 10:15 a.m. and exiting at 10:47 a.m., carrying nothing on entry and carrying a similar white envelope on exit. Carter argued this corroborated Rebecca's testimony. She received the envelope from David and kept it until his death. Miller argued the footage didn't prove the contents of the envelopes. She said the video showed people carrying envelopes, nothing more. Anyone could carry a white envelope. It didn't mean the envelope contained a DNA test, and it certainly didn't prove the envelope Rebecca delivered was the same one David received. Carter responded by pointing to the timeline. The dates matched. The locations matched. David went to Dr. Nguyen's lab, got a sealed envelope, and 9 years later, Rebecca went to the same lab with a sealed envelope. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Judge Burke said she would review all the evidence presented and issue a ruling on admissibility within 2 weeks. She dismissed the court. For 2 weeks, Ethan lived in limbo. He went to work at the automotive repair shop where he had been employed for 8 years, but he couldn't focus. He changed oil, rotated tires, replaced brake pads, all on autopilot. His co-workers asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. He wasn't. Carter told him to be patient. Judge Burke was thorough. She would review every piece of evidence, every argument, every legal precedent. The chain of custody issue was close. It could go either way. But Carter believed they had done enough. The surveillance footage was the clincher. It tied the whole narrative together. Marcus, meanwhile, retreated from public life. He stopped going to the office. He stopped returning calls from business partners. Andrea Miller handled everything. She told Marcus the case was still winnable. Even if the DNA test was admitted, they could argue David's intent. The will named Marcus as the sole heir. A cryptic note didn't change that. They could argue that David's silence for 9 years proved he didn't want Ethan to inherit. But Marcus wasn't thinking about legal arguments. He was thinking about his father. David had lied to him. For his entire life, Marcus believed he was the only son. He believed he was special, chosen, the one David trusted to carry on the family business. Now he knew the truth. He wasn't special. He was just the son David acknowledged because he was convenient, because his mother was David's wife, because it was easier to love the child who fit into the narrative David wanted to tell. Marcus asked Miller what would happen if they lost. She said Ethan would be entitled to a share of the estate. Under Arizona intestacy law, biological children inherit equally. That meant the estate would be split. Marcus would get half. Ethan would get half. $7 million divided into 2 portions of $3.5 million each. Marcus said he didn't care about the money. He cared about the betrayal. Miller said she understood, but the court only dealt with money and property. It didn't deal with feelings. 2 weeks later, Judge Burke issued her written decision. The courtroom was packed again. Ethan sat with Carter, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Marcus sat with Miller, staring straight ahead. Judge Burke entered and took her seat. She didn't waste time. She said she had carefully reviewed all the evidence, all the testimony, and all the legal arguments. She acknowledged that the chain of custody was not perfect. There was a gap of 9 years during which the envelope's location was documented only through witness testimony. But, she said, the law didn't require perfection. It required reasonableness. Burke said the corroborating evidence was strong. The lab records matched the envelope. The financial records confirmed David paid for a test. The surveillance footage showed David visiting the lab and leaving with a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the note Rebecca provided was authenticated as David's. The courier's transport log was meticulous, and most importantly, the seal on the envelope remained intact, showing no signs of tampering, according to the forensic examiner. Burke said that while it was theoretically possible someone could have fabricated or altered the envelope, the evidence supporting authenticity far outweighed the speculative possibility of fraud. She ruled the DNA test admissible. Ethan exhaled. Carter put a hand on his shoulder. Across the aisle, Miller's jaw tightened. Marcus closed his eyes. Judge Burke ordered the envelope opened in court. A clerk brought it forward. Burke carefully cut the seal with scissors, preserving the evidence tape for the record. She removed the contents. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a laboratory report from Dr. Nguyen's lab, dated April 14, 2016. Burke read the report aloud. Sample A, David Whitmore. Sample B, Ethan Cole. Analysis. STR markers tested, 12 of 13 conclusive matches. Combined paternity index, 8,547,293. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. The courtroom was silent. Burke placed the report on the bench and looked up. She said the court now moved to the question of heirship. She set a new hearing date for arguments on whether Ethan was entitled to inherit, and if so, how the estate should be divided. Miller stood immediately. She requested permission to file post-ruling motions. Burke granted it. Miller said she would argue that even if the DNA test proved biological paternity, Ethan should not inherit, because David deliberately chose not to acknowledge him during his lifetime. She would invoke the doctrine of equitable estoppel. Carter said he would respond in writing. The hearing was adjourned. Equitable estoppel is a legal principle that prevents someone from claiming a right if doing so would be unjust or unfair based on prior conduct. In inheritance cases, it's sometimes used to bar biological children from inheriting if the parent clearly and deliberately rejected them during life. Miller's argument was straightforward. David Whitmore knew about Ethan for over 30 years. He had the DNA test results for 9 years. He never amended his will to include Ethan. He never contacted Ethan. He never provided financial support. He never acknowledged the relationship publicly or privately. That silence, Miller argued, was a deliberate choice. David didn't want Ethan to inherit. The court shouldn't rewrite David's will just because a DNA test proved biology. Carter's counter-argument was equally direct. David's note in the will, "If Ethan comes forward, he deserves to know," showed intent. David wanted Ethan to have the truth, and the truth was that Ethan was his son. Moreover, David's decision to keep the DNA test sealed rather than destroy it suggested he wanted the test to be found eventually. If David truly wanted to exclude Ethan, he would have destroyed the evidence. Instead, he preserved it and left instructions for Rebecca to deliver it. Carter also pointed to Arizona law. The state's intestacy statutes are clear. Biological children inherit unless they are legally adopted by someone else, or unless paternity is formally contested and disproven. There's no exception for children the parent chose not to acknowledge. Biology creates the legal relationship. Silence doesn't erase it. Miller filed a 20-page brief arguing her position. She cited cases from other states where courts had used equitable estoppel to deny inheritance to biological children. In one case, a man fathered a child out of wedlock, never acknowledged the child, and left a will giving everything to his wife and legitimate children. When the biological child sued after his death, the court ruled that the father's consistent refusal to acknowledge the child during his life stopped the child from claiming inheritance after death. Carter filed a 30-page response. He distinguished the cases Miller cited. In those cases, the fathers had explicitly denied paternity or taken legal action to avoid parental obligations. David Whitmore did neither. He simply stayed silent. And silence, Carter argued, was not the same as rejection. Silence could mean fear, shame, confusion, or conflict. It didn't necessarily mean intent to disinherit. Judge Burke scheduled oral arguments. The hearing took place on a cool October morning. The courtroom had become familiar to everyone involved. Same seats, same faces, same tension hanging in the air. Miller stood first. She argued that inheritance law must respect the wishes of the deceased. David Whitmore had the power to include Ethan in his will. He chose not to. That choice should be honored. She said the note in the will was vague and ambiguous. "He deserves to know" didn't mean he deserves to inherit. It just meant David thought Ethan should know the truth about his paternity. Truth and money are not the same thing. Miller also argued that allowing Ethan to inherit would be unfair to Marcus. Marcus grew up as David's acknowledged son. He worked in the family business. He was present at holidays, birthdays, family events. He earned his place in David's life. Ethan, through no fault of his own, was absent. But that absence meant he didn't have the same relationship with David. He didn't earn the inheritance the way Marcus did. Judge Burke asked Miller to clarify. Was she arguing that inheritance should be based on the quality of the relationship rather than the biological tie? Miller said yes, in cases where the parent made a clear choice to exclude the biological child. Burke asked how the court should measure the quality of a relationship. Miller admitted it was subjective, but she said David's actions spoke for themselves. He had decades to include Ethan. He didn't. Carter stood for his argument. He began by addressing the fundamental question: what does the law require for inheritance? He said Arizona law is clear. A biological child inherits unless legally barred by adoption, formal contest of paternity, or explicit disinheritance in a will. David's will did none of those things. The will was silent on Ethan because David wrote it before Ethan came forward. The note was added later, showing David's awareness of Ethan's existence and his belief that Ethan deserved the truth. Carter argued that deserves to know implied more than just information. It implied recognition, acknowledgement, and rights. Why else would David preserve the DNA test? Why else would he give it to Rebecca with instructions to deliver it if he died? David knew what that test meant. It meant Ethan was his son, and being a son meant inheritance rights. Carter also addressed Miller's fairness argument. He said the law doesn't measure inheritance by the quality of relationships. If it did, every estate case would devolve into subjective judgments about who loved whom more, who spent more time together, who was a better child. The law uses objective standards: marriage, biology, adoption, legal acknowledgement. Ethan met the objective standard. He was biologically David's son. Judge Burke asked Carter about David's silence. She said it was undeniable that David never reached out to Ethan during his life. Didn't that suggest David didn't want a relationship? Carter said it suggested David struggled with the decision. Fear, shame, and guilt can paralyze people. David's silence didn't mean he wanted Ethan excluded from the estate. It meant he didn't know how to face what he'd done. Burke asked if there was any evidence David intended for Ethan to inherit. Carter pointed to the note again. He also pointed to the fact that David preserved the DNA test for 9 years. If David wanted to hide the truth permanently, he could have destroyed the test. Instead, he kept it safe and left instructions for it to be delivered. That was evidence of intent. Judge Burke did something unusual. She allowed both sides to present character witnesses who could speak to David's character and possible intent. This wasn't standard in probate cases, but Burke said the equitable estoppel argument required understanding David's mindset. Miller called Marcus to the stand. It was the first time Marcus had testified. He looked older than his 47 years, the strain of the case etched into his face. Miller asked Marcus to describe his relationship with his father. Marcus said it was close. They worked together for over 20 years. David taught him the business, brought him on site visits, trusted him with major decisions. They had dinner together once a week. They went fishing every summer. When Marcus's daughter was born, David was there at the hospital, holding his granddaughter and crying with joy. Miller asked if David ever mentioned Ethan. Marcus said no. Not once. Miller asked if David ever seemed troubled, guilty, or conflicted about his past. Marcus said his father had his private moments, but he never discussed them. Marcus assumed it was just the stress of business. Miller asked Marcus how he felt when he learned about Ethan. Marcus paused. He said he felt betrayed. Not by Ethan, but by his father. He said his entire sense of identity was built on being David Whitmore's son. Now he learned he was one of David Whitmore's sons. It changed everything. Carter cross-examined. He asked Marcus if he believed his father was a good man. Marcus said yes, despite everything. Carter asked if good people could make mistakes and struggle to fix them. Marcus said yes. Carter asked if Marcus thought his father loved him. Marcus said he did. Carter asked if it was possible David loved Ethan too, but didn't know how to show it. Marcus said he didn't know. It was possible. Carter asked if Marcus would accept Ethan as a brother. Marcus said he didn't know. He needed time. Carter thanked him and sat down. Carter called Claire to the stand. Ethan's mother had been reluctant to testify, but Carter convinced her it was necessary. Carter asked Claire to describe her relationship with David. Claire said they dated for about a year when they were in their 20s. David was ambitious, charming, full of big dreams. She loved him. When she got pregnant, she told him. He panicked. He said he wasn't ready to be a father. He said he had business plans, goals he needed to achieve. He offered her money to terminate the pregnancy. She refused. He offered her money to stay quiet and raise the child alone. She refused that too. She said if he didn't want to be involved, fine. But she wasn't taking his money. Carter asked if David ever tried to contact Ethan after he was born. Claire said no. She reached out once when Ethan was 5 years old, sent a letter with a picture of Ethan. David never replied. Carter asked how Ethan grew up. Claire said he grew up without a father. He asked questions. She gave vague answers. She didn't want to poison him against David, but she didn't want to lie either. She told him his father wasn't ready to be a parent. She said some men ran from responsibility. Carter asked if she ever regretted keeping Ethan. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She said never. Not once. Ethan was the best thing that ever happened to her. Miller declined to cross-examine. She said Claire's testimony was moving, but it didn't address David's intent regarding the estate. Judge Burke took 1 week to deliberate. When she reconvened the court, the tension was suffocating. Ethan sat with his mother on one side and Carter on the other. Marcus sat alone, Miller beside him but feeling distant. Burke began by acknowledging the complexity of the case. She said inheritance law intersects with morality, but courts can't base rulings purely on moral judgments. They must apply statutes and precedents. She said Arizona Revised Statute Section 14.2.1114 addresses inheritance by biological children. The statute says a biological child inherits from a parent if paternity is established by clear and convincing evidence. The DNA test met that standard. Ethan was David Whitmore's biological son with 99.97% certainty. Burke addressed Miller's equitable estoppel argument. She said the doctrine requires clear, affirmative conduct by the decedent that would make it unjust to allow inheritance. Silence alone is not enough. There must be evidence the parent actively rejected the child, denied paternity in legal proceedings, or took steps to sever the relationship. David Whitmore did none of those things. He never denied paternity. He never contested Ethan's claim. In fact, he obtained a DNA test proving paternity and preserved it for 9 years. His note in the will acknowledged Ethan's existence and stated, Ethan deserves to know. Burke said this showed awareness and, at minimum, ambivalence, not active rejection. Burke ruled that Ethan was David Whitmore's heir under Arizona law. She moved to the question of how to divide the estate. Under Arizona intestacy law, when a person dies with multiple children and no spouse, the children inherit equally. But David did leave a will naming Marcus as the primary beneficiary. The will predated David's acknowledgement of Ethan in the note. Burke said she had discretion to balance the statutory default with the testator's expressed intent. The will showed David wanted Marcus to inherit. The note showed David believed Ethan deserved something. She would split the difference. Burke ruled that the estate would be divided 60-40. Marcus would receive 60%, approximately $4,200,000, the family home, and primary ownership of the rental properties. Ethan would receive 40%, approximately $2,800,000, minority stakes in the rental properties, and half of the investment accounts. Burke said the division honored both David's original will and his later acknowledgement of Ethan. It wasn't perfect, but probate law rarely produces perfect outcomes. She said both men lost something. Marcus lost the security of being the sole heir, and Ethan lost years of having a father. The court could give them money, but it couldn't give them back what they truly lost. She entered the judgment. The estate would be distributed within 90 days. Both sides had the right to appeal. Neither side appealed. The Whitmore case became a reference point in Arizona probate law. Legal journals published articles analyzing Judge Burke's reasoning. Some praised her balancing approach, saying it honored both biology and intent. Others criticized it, saying the law should be black and white. Either biology determines inheritance, or written wills do. Mixing the two creates unpredictability. Several law schools included the case in their estate planning courses. Professors used it to teach students about the dangers of incomplete estate planning. If David had simply updated his will after ordering the DNA test, the entire case could have been avoided. But people procrastinate, fear difficult conversations, and leave messes for others to clean up after they're gone. The case also sparked conversations about DNA testing and family secrets. As at-home genetic testing became more popular, more people discovered unexpected biological relationships. Half-siblings emerged, unknown fathers were identified, family trees were rewritten. Courts across the country grappled with how to handle these revelations in probate disputes. Some states introduced legislation clarifying how DNA evidence should be treated in inheritance cases. Others left the law ambiguous, allowing judges discretion. The result was a patchwork of rules that varied wildly depending on jurisdiction. In the weeks after the ruling, Ethan and Marcus met once, unexpectedly. They ran into each other outside the courthouse during a final procedural hearing to sign distribution paperwork. They stood on the stone steps, the Arizona sun beating down, neither sure what to say. Ethan broke the silence. He said he didn't want this to be a fight. He said he never wanted to take anything from Marcus. He just wanted the truth acknowledged. He said if Marcus ever wanted to talk, to get to know each other, to try to be brothers, he was open to it. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He said he appreciated that, but he needed time. He said he wasn't angry at Ethan. He was angry at their father for putting them in this position. He said maybe someday they could sit down and talk, but not yet. He wasn't ready. Ethan nodded. He said he understood. He said the offer would stand whenever Marcus was ready. They shook hands. Then Marcus walked to his car and drove away. They haven't spoken since. Ethan used part of his inheritance to pay off his mother's mortgage. Claire cried when he told her. She said he didn't have to do that. He said he wanted to. She had given up everything to raise him alone. It was the least he could do. He also set up a college fund for his 4-year-old daughter, Emma. He wanted her to have opportunities he never had. He donated $100,000 to a non-profit legal aid organization that helps low-income families navigate paternity and child support cases. He said he wanted something good to come from the pain. Ethan kept his job at the auto repair shop. His co-workers asked why he didn't quit now that he was a millionaire. He said he liked the work. It kept him grounded. He bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, paid cash, and invested the rest. He lived simply. The money didn't change him. The truth did. Marcus sold the family home in Paradise Valley. He said it didn't feel like home anymore. Too many memories, too many ghosts. He moved to Colorado, bought a cabin in the mountains, and started consulting for real estate developers remotely. Friends said he seemed different, quieter, more introspective. He stopped talking about his father. When people asked, he changed the subject. Marcus started therapy. He told the therapist he felt like his entire life had been built on a lie. The therapist said it wasn't a lie. It was an incomplete truth. Marcus said that was just semantics. The therapist said maybe, but semantics matter when you're trying to rebuild your sense of self. Dr. Nguyen continued running her lab. She said the Whitmore case reminded her why meticulous documentation mattered. She now requires clients who request sealed results to store them with third-party custodians, law firms, banks, safety deposit boxes, to avoid chain of custody disputes like the one she witnessed. She also started offering genetic counseling services. She said DNA tests reveal truths people aren't always prepared to handle. She wanted to help clients understand the implications before they opened the envelope. Aunt Rebecca reconnected with Claire. The estrangement that had lasted 20 years ended. Rebecca said keeping David's secret was one of the hardest things she ever did. She said there were nights she almost called Claire and told her everything, but she kept her promise. She said seeing Ethan get his truth made the burden worth carrying. Claire forgave her. She said Rebecca did what she thought was right. That's all anyone can do. Judge Alison Burke retired from the bench a year after the Whitmore ruling. In an exit interview with the Arizona Bar Journal, she called the case one of the most challenging of her career. She said the law gave her tools to resolve the financial dispute, but it couldn't resolve the underlying pain. That, she said, was something only families could work through. She said if she could give advice to anyone writing a will, it would be this: don't leave secrets for your heirs to discover. If you have unresolved relationships, address them before you die. Write a letter, update your will, have the hard conversation. Because silence doesn't protect anyone. It just transfers the burden to the people you leave behind. DNA testing has revolutionized inheritance law, but it has also exposed uncomfortable truths about how families function. Biology doesn't always align with legal relationships. Love doesn't always align with DNA. And the truth, when it finally emerges, doesn't always bring peace. David Whitmore spent 9 years with a sealed envelope containing proof of his paternity. 9 years he could have used to reach out to Ethan, to build a relationship, to make amends. He didn't. Maybe he intended to and ran out of time. Maybe he hoped someone else would handle it after he was gone. Maybe he was just a coward. We'll never know. And that's the cruelest part. The people who leave secrets behind don't have to live with the fallout. Ethan does. Marcus does. Claire does. They're the ones who have to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. Some people argue that David did the right thing by preserving the DNA test. At least he didn't destroy the evidence. At least he left a trail for Ethan to follow. Others argue he did the worst thing possible. He confirmed the truth, but refused to act on it. He gave Ethan proof of paternity, but denied him a father. That's not kindness. That's cruelty disguised as consideration. The law treated the case as a question of property distribution. Who gets what share of $7 million? But for the people involved, it was never about money. It was about identity, belonging, and the fundamental question of what makes someone family. Marcus lost his sense of being special. Ethan gained acknowledgement, but not acceptance. Neither of them got what they truly wanted. They got a court ruling and a check. The rest, healing, forgiveness, brotherhood, that's something no judge can order. Cases like the Whitmore dispute are becoming more common. Every day, someone takes a mail-in DNA test and discovers a half-sibling they never knew existed. Every day, someone learns their father wasn't their biological father, or their mother had a child she never mentioned. These revelations tear through families like earthquakes, shattering foundations people thought were solid. The legal system tries to manage the fallout. Courts divide estates, establish paternity, enforce inheritance rights. But the law is a blunt instrument. It can't heal wounds. It can't create love where there was none. It can only redistribute assets and hope the people involved find their own path forward. David Whitmore ordered a DNA test in 2016. The result was 99.97% certainty. But certainty doesn't mean clarity. Knowing the truth doesn't tell you what to do with it. David knew Ethan was his son, and he still chose silence. That choice had consequences. Ethan got his inheritance. He got his truth. But he didn't get his father. And Marcus got his share of the estate, but he lost his sense of who he was. Both of them carry scars that money can't erase. The envelope sat sealed for 9 years, containing a truth that could have changed everything. When it was finally opened, it did change things, but not in the way anyone hoped. It didn't bring a family together. It revealed how broken they always were. Some truths set you free. Some truths just show you the bars of the cage you've been living in all along. This was one of those truths. The DNA test exposed what they hid for years. But exposure isn't the same as healing. Recognition isn't the same as love. And 99.97% certainty doesn't answer the question that haunts both Ethan and Marcus to this day. What if David had been brave enough to tell the truth while he was still alive? We'll never know. The envelope is open. The truth is out. And 2 half-brothers live with the weight of a father who couldn't face what he'd done. That's the legacy David Whitmore left behind, not $7 million. Not rental properties or investment accounts, but two sons who share blood and a last name and nothing else. The truth came out, but no one knows if it was worth the cost.